Okay, thank you. Right, hopefully everybody will now be put in automatically. So good morning, everyone, both virtually and in the room. My name's Ellie McKinnon. For those of you who don't know me, I'm a trustee and also the Chief Executive of the Cheviot Trust, so responsible for the operational side. I do have other trustees in the room with me, our chairman in particular, Sir Derek Morris, who's going to wave right now down there. And we also have Giles Alton and Gerald Kidd, who are here as trustees. There are other trustees, I think, virtually, but obviously you can't see them. So, to start, we appreciate, the whole trustee board appreciates this is a very difficult issue for everyone. And we do have a range of attendees from heavy pension specialists. I don't mean heavy in a physical sense, obviously, but people who spend their life doing pensions work, to people who are not in that situation. So for those of you who are pension experts, apologies in advance if we dumb this down a bit, but we just need to make sure that everybody really understands what the issues are. We've got a lot of slides, so we're going to go through those slides and then have questions at the end rather than break into the slides, because otherwise there's a danger we won't get through them. For those of you who have given me questions in advance, I've done my very best. I won't have succeeded in every case, but I've done my very best to include answers either in my slides or in somebody else's slides. So hopefully, if you've asked a question in advance, you'll get that answered if you hang on through the slides. So this is the structure. So I'm going to do a very, very quick introduction. Anna Copestake from our pensions law is then going to look at the legal background, which is really what's driving all of this. Chris McNair from PwC, and thank you for hosting the meeting, Chris, is then going to talk about covenant assessment and how that feeds into the way that we manage the scheme and how he assesses it. We're then going to have some comments from Ross Nicholson from Schroders, who will explain the investment strategy and what happened last year, which has meant we're in the position that we are in, and give you some performance numbers. Then Peter Black, the scheme actuary, will come on and give you some explanation of the funding basis and where we see that going. I will then do a bit of winding up at the end and conclusions about where we are, what the trustee thinks it needs to do, and what our next steps would be, and how we'd like to encourage employers to have an input into those next steps, so that when we do come back with proposals, which is proposed at the end of September, beginning of October, that we've factored in all your views. So even if you don't get an answer immediately when you email into With Profits, I do look at them every day, and it is very helpful to have your perspective, because it enables us to factor those in. So trustee structure, and I think, I've gone one too far, sorry. There we go. So overview of Cheviot. Cheviot Trustees Limited is the corporate trustee, and we have the Cheviot pension, which has three sections, the middle one of which in orange is the with profit section, which is what we're talking about today. We also run 14 final settlement schemes alongside, and it's all done by the same internal team that provide governance, management and the administration services. So to go on to the trustees, so Derek, as I said, is here, and I've put some comments about him on the left-hand side, and I think that's a very important point to note. He's entirely independent. He doesn't have any with-profit benefits or any connections to anybody who does have with-profit benefits, and that's very helpful. The rest of the board, there are 4 member trustees, 4 employer representatives, and 1 other co-op director, who is me. Now, the 4 employer representatives all represent firms that have with-profit liabilities. So you can be sure as employers that your voice is very clearly and loudly heard at the trustee board level. I think it's worth being absolutely clear about how we manage conflicts of interest on this as well, because obviously it is really difficult. And we do declare everybody's conflicts at every meeting, so everybody knows, is reminded of what conflicts we've had. ARC is a pension firm who are advising us do not have any conflicts, because they're a relatively new firm, which is helpful. And we're also have recently appointed Angela from Hogan Lovells to provide us some advice in relation to privilege, and she will be chipping in at any questions at the end. It's probably worth mentioning that the majority of trustees are also non-affiliated, and that means in this context that they don't have a business connection to the trust. Obviously I do because I'm employed by them, but most people don't. So we run with a very high standard of governance, and this is because we were driven by the Master Trust Authorisation process back in 2019 to have to meet very stringent requirements of governance, and we took the decision at the time that we wouldn't just introduce that governance structure for the money purchase section, we'd do it across the board. So both the final salary schemes and this section, the with profit section, are run on the same governance platform, and that governance platform has got these 4 core elements, and those are regularly reviewed by the pensions regulator in order to maintain our authorisation as a master trust. So we have meetings with them at least twice a year, when I have to give them information very regularly, normally quarterly. So the governance structure is reasonable and detailed and robust, as sort of rubber stamped by the regulator. So Cheviot history, not going to really hover on this because you'll know it. There's one I've missed out. Just to say that the with profit sections was when Cheviot started in 1930, so it has been around a really long time, but it has changed. So in 1988, which is the one I've missed off this, it changed from a deferred annuity basis where people earn chunks of income to get in their retirement each year to a cash accumulation, which is the kind of DC vehicle that you understand today. We closed it to new money in 2002, which is why this is such a historical scheme for all sorts of reasons. And then the legislative change, which Anna will go into in much more detail, imposed funding requirements on employers as it changed basically from being a money purchase to, in effect, a defined benefit scheme under the funding regulations. So benefit structure, I'm not going to hover on this, just to say that the benefit structure had guaranteed rates of return. So this is from 1988 of between 3 and 5%. It was 5% in 1988, and I reduced it as much as I could to 3% by the time we closed to new money. That was intended to be topped up by a discretionary bonus system. Now, if you look at the 5%, which is what I did when I arrived, I thought 5% guarantee. That was on the basis of interest rates of 10 at the time. So it sounds ridiculous now, but at the time it was actually quite reasonable. But it hadn't been looked at, and we haven't paid any discretionary bonuses to top up those returns since 2001. And similarly for pensioners who retired before 1997 had their increases wholly linked to the bonus structure. So again, they have not had any increases since 2001. And so the value of their pension has fallen. People retiring after that date have got some level of inflation proof built in. So it's easier for them. And I'm not going to talk about the last one because Anna will pick that up. So communications with employers. I think it's just worth going back very quickly to describe what happened before the status was changed. And I know there's certainly some people in the room, one of my former chairmen, for example, down there, who's very well aware of how it all hit us. And we did engage with employers before the legislation even came into force. And there was a group that came with us to the DWP to give the employers' perspective on what they were doing, which was very helpful. It may not feel that at this precise moment, but they were asking us to do a lot of backtracking, which we managed to persuade them that we didn't need to do. So once it was reclassified in 2014, we then have been giving regular communications, and I appreciate that you may not all have had them, or maybe we were contacting the wrong person within your firm, but we have done some work on our database, so hopefully it will all be now a bit more effective. And if there are changes you need to make, please just email the withprofits@cheviottrust.com email address. We've held regular meetings. I think they've been almost annual. I'm not sure that we managed one in 2020 for obvious reasons, but I think that in general they have been annual. And those were designed to help employers understand what the current position was, what the risks were, and how we'll be doing against our targets. And the objective has always been to reach a position where we can buy out those benefits with a third party and discharge all the employers. And that continues to be our objective. We're just facing a few challenges at the moment. So I think that's all I was going to say by way of introduction. So I'll hand over to Anna, who will give you the legal background.
Thanks, Ellie. My role is to provide a bit more detail about the legal structure of the with profit section and how it's changed over time. I'll cover how it was originally a money purchase pension arrangement and how that treatment was changed by legislation. I'll then talk about the employer contribution rule itself and how it works. It's worth noting that people often use the terms money purchase and defined contribution interchangeably. So if you hear us do that today, we mean the same thing. The with profit section is a non-segregated scheme for employers that have no association with each other. It's not divided into sections, and its assets and liabilities are what we call commingled. They're mixed together. As Ellie mentioned, the with profit section was for many years, as a matter of law, a money purchase pension arrangement, and it was managed by the trustee on that basis. This meant that employers were only liable to pay ordinary contributions due in respect of their members. There was no employer contribution rule to address funding deficits, nor was there any need for one. The section closed to those ordinary contributions from employers and members in 2002. However, in the mid-2000s, the courts began to consider what was meant by a money purchase pension arrangement. This culminated in a case in 2011 in which the Supreme Court examined the dividing line for the purposes of pensions legislation between defined benefit, also known as final salary, and money purchase pension schemes. It concluded that schemes with features similar to the with profit section were money purchase schemes. It confirmed that the treatment of the section over the years had been correct. The Secretary for Work and Pensions, however, disagreed with the outcome of that case. It wanted more schemes with features like the with profit section to fall outside of the definition of a money purchase pension scheme. The result was that pensions legislation was changed with effect from July 2014. The with profit section was no longer, as a matter of law, a money purchase scheme from that time. It became what's known as a cash balance pension arrangement. This change in law had significant implications for the with profit section, the trustee, and employers. Cash balance schemes are subject to scheme-specific funding requirements under the Pensions Act 2004. The with profit section had to comply with that regime and still does, which requires actuarial valuations at least every 3 years and deficit repair contributions if there is underfunding. And Peter's going to talk more about this later. This reclassification also meant that the with profit section became subject to what's known as the Section 75 debt regime. This means that statutory debts are triggered by certain events, including employer insolvencies or wind-ups. Those debts are calculated on the basis of securing member benefits with an insurance company. Only with profits employers who employed active members, as at the 31st of December 2002, are statutory employers. So it's only those employers who must comply with these statutory funding obligations I've just talked about, albeit the section as a whole is more likely to fall under the scrutiny of the pensions regulator. This created inequality amongst the employer group. At the time the legislation was changed, a relatively small group of employers became statutory employers. There was a much larger group of employers who were not statutory employers, but to whom liabilities of the with profit section were attributed. It was that inequality that led to the trustee introducing the employer contribution rule. A cash balance scheme is supported by investment returns and any contributions payable by employers. It was therefore considered important to broaden the scope of employers with funding obligations to the section to all those to whom with profit section liabilities can reasonably be attributed. The trustee applied to the court for authorisation to use the trust's amendment power to introduce the employer contribution rule. The court granted the order in February 2015. It agreed the trustee could use the amendment power to do this. the contribution rule was introduced by an amendment to the with profit section rules. It was introduced with effect from the 25th of March 2015. It enables the trustee to require funding contributions from the employer which incurred the liability or its successor, so not only from that small group of statutory employers. In practice, this enables the trustee to take account of the covenant of the wider group of employers, and Chris is going to explain how that works later. Throughout these changes, the trustee was and continues to be represented by leading counsel. Case law since the contribution rule was introduced, notably the 2015 Merchant Navy Ratings Pension Fund case, further supports the introduction of the contribution rule. The rule itself is similar to other industry-wide pension arrangements. So a little bit about the structure of the rule. It's contained in Schedule 5 of the Deed of Consolidation dated the 19th of February 2023. Those are the current rules governing the trust, and they're available on the website. All with profits employers are bound by the rule and must pay contributions if required to do so by the trustee. The rule gives the trustee the ability to require with profits employers to pay ordinary deficit repair contributions and additional contributions following trigger events. It also contains a power to discharge an employer if the trustee agrees. I'm now going to talk about each of these elements in a little bit more detail. But before I do, I was asked just to address a specific question that has been raised in advance of this session, which is whether there's any defined period in which the trustee can exercise its powers under this rule, i.e. is there a limitation period? And the answer to that is no. Whilst the scheme is ongoing, the contribution rule is available to the trustee. In fact, it has a duty, like it does with all of its other powers under the trustee and rules, to consider from time to time whether it should exercise the rule. And the current circumstances of the with profit section make that particularly pertinent. So firstly, ordinary contributions. If there's a funding shortfall on an ongoing basis, which is the calculation of the cost of providing the benefits as they fall due, for example, following an actuarial valuation, the trustee can require with profits employers to pay ordinary deficit repair contributions, the purpose being to reduce or eliminate the shortfall. The trustee must take the scheme actuary's advice before deciding to do this. There was no shortfall identified following the 2014, the 2017 or the 2020 valuations, so the trustee did not exercise the contribution rule. The next valuation is due as at the 31st of December 2023, so later this year, although the trustee does have the power to call an early valuation if it considers that would be appropriate. And Peter's going to talk through the valuation process later. Next, we have additional contributions. The trustee can require the payment of these if a trigger event takes place. Trigger events include an actual or likely employer insolvency, a business transfer, or other circumstances such as the dissolution of a partnership. These additional contributions are calculated by reference to what we call the buyout deficit. So that's the cost of securing member benefits with an insurance company. If the employer in question is a statutory employer, so that's an entity to whom those statutory regimes I talked about earlier apply to, then an additional payment under the statutory regime would be required as well. So we've talked about contributions by reference to funding deficits, whether that's on an ongoing basis when talking about ordinary contributions or a buyout basis when talking about additional ones. However, an employer's liability will relate to its share of those deficits. The trustee has complete discretion under the contribution rule over how to allocate the share of liabilities and track the deficits. In doing so, the trustee's objective has been to try to be fair amongst employers. Each employer's share of liabilities were calculated as at the 31st of December 2013. It's based on membership and benefits at that date. Broadly, the value of the benefits of members attributable to that employer or its predecessor, plus a proportionate share of the value of liabilities in respect of employers that, for example, have become insolvent, and that they're what's known as orphan liabilities. Peter's going to talk in more detail about this later and provide an illustrative example. But by their nature, orphan liabilities can change, for example, due to subsequent employer insolvencies, as can the cost of providing benefits. The employer's share is expressed as a fixed percentage, and it's been provided to you by the trustee. And that percentage can be applied to the funding deficits that are published on the website. All with-profits employers remain bound by the contribution rule, even if the last member attributed to them dies or transfers out. They're liable under the rule until discharged by the trustee or the termination of the with-profits section. The only way for an employer to be discharged is for the trustee to give its agreement under the discharge power in the contribution rule itself. If the trustee agrees to discharge an employer, it can require an additional lump sum payment. So that's in addition to those other types of contributions I've talked about. And the trustee can decide the amount of that payment and would do so on the advice of the scheme actuary. A discharge under the contribution rule would mean that an employer stops being a with-profits employer for the purpose of the with-profits section rule. It would not discharge the employer from any statutory liability that might also apply. The trustee's policy has been not to discharge employers under the contribution rule. This has been to try and ensure fairness between employers, avoid deterioration in the combined covenant of the employers, and avoid unnecessary costs in agreeing a number of firm-by-firm discharges. This policy is kept under review, and the trustee considers any requests on their individual merits. It's currently considering whether the circumstances of the with-profits section suggest that a change to this general policy is possible, appropriate, and in the interest of scheme members, bearing in mind the strength of a combined employer covenant. I'll now hand over to Chris to explain more about that employer covenant and what it means in practice.
Good morning, everyone. So I'm Chris McNair. I'm a senior master in the employer covenant team at PwC, and I'm here this morning to give you a bit of background about the concept of employer covenant. I think it's a bit that's the jargon there, but then to explain how we approach the assessment of employer covenant when it comes to the with-profits section. So if we start off with what employer covenant actually is. So employer covenant is essentially the strength of the business or the businesses that support a pension scheme, but it's a relative assessment, so it's relative to the size and the funding needs of those pension schemes. And in terms of the role of employer covenant, the Pensions Regulator and its 2015 guidance on employer covenant sets out what the role of employer covenant is when it comes to trustee decision making. So it essentially says that the role is twofold. The first is to determine an appropriate investment strategy for the scheme in terms of a level of investment risk that is supportable by the employers. And then the second is to determine an appropriate funding strategy for the scheme. So that is an appropriate set of assumptions that's used by the scheme actuary in determining the size of the liabilities of the pension scheme, but also if there is calculated to be a deficit in the scheme, and coming up with a recovery plan, length and shape, which is appropriate based on the strength of the employers as well. So that's employer covenant and the role of employer covenant. In terms of how we go about assessing employer covenant, so employer covenant is typically assessed on a 4-band rating scale, and this is the same scale that's used by the Pensions Regulator. So the 4-band rating scale starts at weak and goes all the way up to strong. And in terms of a typical assessment process, that will look at 6 key covenant areas, which are shown on screen at the moment. So the first of those is access to value and key stakeholders. So who actually are the employers of the pension scheme and who are the competing stakeholders of those organisations? So when we talk about competing stakeholders, we're talking about people like lenders who provide finance to the organisations. We're talking about shareholders. We're talking about other competing pension scheme positions. So mapping out all those different stakeholder positions also the size of those stakeholder positions and the order of priority of stakeholder positions as well. So does anyone have any security over assets, that type of thing. The next one is current and future profits in cash. So looking at the level of profits in cash that's generated by the employers, both historically in terms of over the last few years, but also looking forward as well based on management's projections. And as I mentioned before, it's a relative assessment. So looking at the level of profits in cash that's generated relative to the funding needs of the pension scheme. The next one's balance sheet and financing. So looking at the size of the balance sheet again in terms of the size of its net assets, but also what are the assets and liabilities that actually make up the balance sheet of the employer. And as part of that assessment, we usually look at things like the level of debt, which sits within the employer as well. So the level of debt relative to earnings to get a sense of what the sort of financial stability of the employer is as part of that assessment. The next one down is wider group strength. So if the employer sits as part of a wider corporate group, we'll have a look at that wider group to assess whether or not there are any sort of key strengths and risks associated with that group, which could impact on the employer covenant of the employer itself. The next one there's affordability. So combining that assessment of cash generation that I spoke about before, but also looking at liquidity, so liquid reserves as well. So typically the cash reserves of the employer, however, that assessment might also look at things like headroom and debt facility. And then the final key area there is what we call the exit covenant. And essentially what the exit covenant is, it's like a hypothetical downside event. So if hypothetically the employer was solvent, what might the realisation from its assets be in that insolvency process, and what would that mean for the scheme in terms of a sort of potential return from those assets? And based on the funding needs of the scheme, the funding position of the scheme, would that result in the scheme getting all or most of its deficit being met? Or actually would there be a significant shortfall to the deficit in that hypothetical scenario? So those are the 6 key covenant areas that we typically look at as part of an employer covenant assessment. So there's various bits of legislation and regulation out there which outline the sort of roles and responsibilities of pension schemes. There are just a few that I wanted to bring out as part of this presentation because they really do underpin the assessment of the employer covenant. So as you'll be able to tell by now, one of the key things when it comes to employer covenant assessment is making sure the trustees and their advisors have access to up-to-date financial information on the employer. So to make sure that we have an up-to-date view on the employer covenant, which can then feed into that decision funding and assessment strategy. So Regulation 6.1 of the Occupational Pension Schemes Regulations sets out the sort of employer obligation to provide information as part of that process to allow trustees and their professional advisors to carry out their duties. And it specifically talks about events that are material or could be material to the pension scheme and being provided with information in relation to those. This is expanded out further in the regulators, what it calls its DB funding code. And within the DB funding code, it talks about the expectation that there's a collaborative working relationship between employers and trustees. And that includes the sharing of information, but it also talks about where there's an understanding that some of that information may be sensitive or may be confidential, and it encourages trustees and employers to work together in those situations to try and find a solution where information is confidential or sensitive. So putting in place things like non-disclosure, that make sure that the trustees still have access to that information. As I mentioned before, there is guidance out there from the regulator. The last update to the guidance was in 2015, but there is guidance out there from the regulator which sets out how the regulator expects trustees and their assess employer covenant, but also how it should be factored into trustee decision making. The last update was in 2015. There is expected to be a new set of employer covenant guidance released either later this year or the start of next year. And then the final point I just wanted to flag as part of this table is the introduction of the Pension Scheme Act 2021, which is relatively new but which brought in increased powers for the pensions regulator in relation to events which could increase the risk to pension scheme member benefits. And as a result of the introduction of the Pension Schemes Act, there's now increased regulator scrutiny when it comes to those type of events. So when there is corporate events such as employer mergers, the regulator wants to make sure that there has been an assessment done between the employer and the trustees to make sure those events haven't had an adverse impact on the security of members' benefits as part of that process. So that's the sort of introduction to employer covenant. Bringing it back to the with profit section specifically. So the employer covenant that is provided to the with profit section is provided by over 400 individual law firms, and those vary in size from law firms with sort of 10 or less solicitors all the way up to your sort of large multinational law firms as well. And the strength of employer covenant that's provided to the with profit section is based on the combined financial strength of those organisations. In terms of the approach that we take to assessing the employment covenant for the with profit section, because it is a multi-employer scheme and because there are over 400 different employers, the approach that we take is a KPI-led approach. And this is consistent with many other multi-employer schemes out there. However, the approach that we take is tailored to the nature of the employer base. So the metrics that we use here are specific to law firms. And in general, the approach follows the flowchart that I've got on screen at the moment, which is that we gather the most recent information that's available on the employers. We calculate a number of financial KPIs on a combined basis for those employers. We take those results and compare them to a set of thresholds that have been set. And then that forms the basis of what the overall covenant rating is for the with profit section. So if I can just dive into a little bit more detail about that. Starting off with the financial ratios that we use. So there are 5 ratios that we use in total. As I said, these have been tailored to be specific to the employer base here, so be specific to law firms. Just to reiterate what I said in the last slide, these are calculated on a basis. So if we take the first ratio, for example, funding coverage, this looks at employer profitability. And the way that this ratio is calculated is we combine the profit of employers and compare that to the overall funding needs of the scheme. So we don't look at things on an employer by employer basis, we'll look at them on a combined basis. And the reason that we've selected these 5 ratios in particular is because these provide us with that coverage over the 6 key covenant areas that I spoke about on the second slide, I think, to make sure we have covenant across those key covenant areas. Just going down these very quickly. So as I mentioned, there are 5 in total. The first one, funding coverage, that looks at the combined profits of the employers versus the overall funding needs of the with profit section. The second ratio there, net asset coverage, that looks at the combined net assets of the employers relative to the estimated deficit in the with profit section. The third one looks at liquidity, and it looks at the combined cash reserves of the employers relative to the estimated deficit of the with profit section. The fourth one, as I mentioned previously, when we look at balance sheet, not only do we look at the size of the balance sheet, we also look at the makeup of the balance sheet. So this one is a metric of financial stability, and we look at balance sheet gearing as part of that. And then the fifth metric we use is to cover that hypothetical downside scenario that I spoke about earlier, that exit covenant. And we use a metric called insolvency value coverage. And essentially what we do to calculate that metric is we look at certain assets on the balance sheet of employers, apply a prudent realisation rate that we think you could be able to get as part of an insolvency process, combine all that value together and compare it to the estimated deficit in the with profit section. So those are the 5 ratios. In terms of what we do next, as I mentioned, we take the results of those financial ratios and we compare those to set thresholds. And you'll see on screen at the moment, we use a 5-band rating scale when it comes to assessing the employer covenant for the with profit section. And we have set thresholds for each of the key financial ratios, but we've also got set thresholds for each of those covenant banding thresholds as well, from 1 up to 5. So in terms of our 5-band rating scale, a 1 out of 5 covenant is the equivalent of a weak covenant that I spoke about before, and a 5 out of 5 covenant is the equivalent of a strong covenant that I spoke about before. And if we just take one for example, so if we take funding coverage, so if the combined profits of the employers of the with-profit section are more than 40 times the estimated deficit in the section, then the covenant rating is 5 out of 5, which is the equivalent of a strong rating. If the combined profits of the employers are less than 5 times, then that is the equivalent of a 1 out of 5 covenant rating, or a weak. So that's in general how we approach the employer covenant assessment. In terms of the most recent assessment that's been performed of the employer covenant of the with-profit section, so we performed a full assessment of the covenant as part of the December 2020 valuation of the with-profit section, to help support the trustees in coming up with an appropriate funding and investment strategy for the scheme. We then did an employer covenant update last year in 2022 to make sure that the strength of the employer covenant hadn't materially changed from the full assessment that we done back in 2021. And you'll see from the graphic on screen here that for each of the 5 key covenant ratios, we ended up breaching the 5 out of 5 threshold. So actually, on an overall basis, the covenant was determined to be strong, and is still determined to be strong. So last slide from me, which is just a recap on some of the things that I've mentioned this morning. So the first thing is that the employer covenant that is provided to the with-profit section is based on the combined financial strength of all of the over 400 law firms that support the scheme. Based on the most recent assessments that have been performed, the strength of the employer covenant is determined to be strong, and that underpins the funding and investment strategy that has been set by the trustees. And then the last point, just to reiterate, was just bringing it back to that information sharing point that I made earlier, just to stress that, especially in light of the introduction of the Pension Scheme Act and the increased regulator scrutiny now, is to make sure that information is being shared proactively with the trustees on an ongoing basis, to make sure that can be factored into the employer covenant assessment, because that's exactly what the regulator would expect as part of this process. So I'm now going to pass on to Ross, who's going to talk about the investment.
Good morning, everybody. So my name is Ross Nicholson. I'm the investment advisor to the Chevia Trust. I'm from Schroders. In terms of what I'm going to cover today, firstly, we're going to talk about the current investment strategy. How do we invest the assets, and why do we invest the assets in that way? We'll then spend quite a bit of time talking about the market context, what happened in the investment markets that led to the deficit that we see today in the with-profit section, and then how that fed through to the with-profit section performance at the end. Okay, so we'll start on the current investment strategy, and a good place to start is the objectives that we set in putting the asset portfolio together. The overarching objective for the with-profit section is ultimately to get to a position of buyout where we can pass the liabilities across to an insurance company in a sensible time frame. And in underpinning that overall objective, we have these 4 separate objectives which are set out in the Statement of Investment Principles for the with-profit section. So firstly, at the top there is to invest the assets of the section such that pension payments can be met and any guaranteed return can be provided to members. That's ultimately the primary objective of this pension scheme. We need to balance the need for earning return against the need to ask contributions in delivering those benefits to members, which is the second one. And then the final 2 really are all about risk management. So, when we invest the assets for the scheme, we're very much trying to avoid the impact of adverse market conditions, be that falls in the equity markets or the bond markets, or the impact on the liability side from interest rates and inflation. And I'll come back to those points in a moment. And in doing so, the final point is we're very much trying to achieve a stable level of return over time, as opposed to taking a lot of risk and trying to shoot the lights out with the assets of the portfolio. So a stable, slow and steady approach to close any deficit. And all of the returns that we're seeking to achieve in investing the assets are linked into Peter Black's actuarial assumptions, as you'll come on to in the next section. Okay. Given those objectives, this is how the assets are then invested. So we have two primary building blocks within the strategy. So the dark navy color is what we call the investment fund. So that's 55% of the assets. That's the part of the portfolio that's seeking to earn return. So that invests across a whole wide range of different markets, be that equity markets, corporate bond markets, government bond markets, cash, and some alternative assets such as hedge funds. It invests not only in a diverse range of different asset classes, but also globally. So it's primarily invested in a very, very diverse way. We don't have all of our eggs in one basket, and we're trying to spread the risk around the different markets. That portfolio is seeking to earn a return of kind of cash plus 3.5% to 4%. So again, coming back to that point, we're not trying to shoot the lights out with that portfolio. It's trying to be slow and steady in terms of how it's invested. It's managed on a very dynamic basis. So it's not a set and forget strategy. When we have a view on equities being the right place to be or bonds being the right place to be, the investment committee makes decisions to move the money around as they see fit. And that also helps to manage down the risk as we come into periods of particular crisis. That's the investment fund. The matching fund then, which is 45% of the assets, is primarily around risk management. That is also termed like an LDI portfolio for those of you that saw LDI in the press towards the back end of last year, and I'll come back to that particular point later. So the matching fund is effectively trying to mitigate the impact of interest rates and inflation movements that we see on the liability side on your deficit. So it's invested in things like UK government bonds, both inflation-linked and fixed, and uses some derivative contracts to also mitigate that risk. When you put those two portfolios together, we get to an overall return target of gilts plus 2.7 for the whole pot. This level of return, as Chris mentioned earlier, is very much linked to the sponsor covenant. For schemes, for pension schemes that are of similar maturity and profile to the profit section, quite a mature membership. It's got less time on its side than, say, more immature pension schemes. This is we'd argue, a slightly higher return. The reason we can target this higher level of return is because of that strong covenant behind the scheme. So the investments can do a lot of the heavy lifting in terms of closing the deficit because we can rely on that covenant, and that's quite a key point. Targeting that higher level of return clearly comes with some higher risks. And we've put a number on that risk at the bottom of this slide here. So in an environment where we see some extreme market events coming through, so what we're measuring here is equities down 20%, interest rates up kind of 1 to 1.5%, corporate bond yields up about 1 to 1.5%, and some other events all happening at the same time. We're running a risk as of today of about £6 million. If we looked at that number about 2 years ago when the asset size was significantly bigger, that number would have been also bigger, circa kind of 9 to 10 million pounds. And that goes both ways in terms of positive and negative. So that's the investment strategy and how it's put together. In terms of the key risks to delivering on that gilts plus 2.7 return, top one, asset risk. Very simply, this is equity markets falling, bond markets falling, and us having exposure in those markets. We manage that risk by being diversified, so not having all of our eggs in one basket, and also by our dynamic approach to managing that investment fund, i.e., selling equities ahead of market crises, buying them as we come into more positive territory. That's the primary risk that we face in the section. If interest rates and inflation are big risks, pension schemes, because they drive the value of the liabilities side of the balance sheet. We mitigate most of our interest rate and inflation exposure away through that 45% matching fund or LDI program that I mentioned on the previous slide. So if that was left unmanaged, that would be a big risk for the scheme, but we managed that down. Okay, so that's where we are in terms of the investment strategy. If I then go on to 2022, and in terms of what went on in markets. So what I have on the slide here, just to give some context, the performance of the assets over this particular period. This slide is showing you in broad markets what levels of return were achieved across the equity markets at the top. So be that global equities, UK equities, US, Europe, etc. Government bonds in the middle, credit, and then some other markets towards the bottom. And I think the striking image from this picture is that everything is very much negative and to the left. One of the real challenges over the 12-month period to the end of December 2022 was that approach of diversification, which I mentioned earlier on, just didn't work. It didn't matter where you invested, there was negative returns coming through. And that was one of the primary challenges that the investment committee faced over that particular period. In more normal market conditions, you might typically see if equities are having a good year, bonds might be having a bad year, and vice versa. Over this particular period, that was not the case. The primary kind of economic backdrop for why it was such a tough year were, firstly, inflation and the impact of inflation on monetary policy decisions. So we saw interest rates starting to rise globally. Interest rates rising had a negative impact, particularly on the equity markets, but also on the bond markets. Coupled with that, we then had the war in Ukraine at the start of last year, which had a negative impact on equity markets as well. And then towards the end of the year in the UK, we had the infamous gilts crisis and the mini budget we had a series of economic shocks that caused markets to be very negative across the board. Now, putting those numbers into context relative to other years we might have seen historically, what we've shown on this slide here is on the left-hand side, we have S&P 500, which is effectively US equity markets. And on the right-hand side, US bond markets. And what we've done is we have taken the performance of, let's say, bond markets on the right every single year for the last 123 years, so since the market existed, and we've stacked it as to where they've sat. So numbers to the left-hand side imply bad years, numbers to the right-hand side imply good years. And what this is telling us is that 2022 is the worst year on record for bond markets. Okay. On the left-hand side, you can see that it was also a pretty tough year for equity markets. So there was only, I think, 15 years ever worse than what we saw last year in US equity markets. And then those numbers are going back to 1871. So, it's quite a long period. In that environment where both equities and bonds are down and diversification is not working, earning a positive return is a real challenge. So hopefully that gives some context on the markets. In the UK then, on top of that challenging global market backdrop, we had the gilts crisis, which was a particularly challenging environment for UK pension schemes in particular. So, many of you, I'm sure most of you in the room will appreciate this, but off the back of the mini budget in late September last year, we saw significant volatility in the UK gilt markets. So this is the chart on the left-hand side, where over the series of a couple of weeks, we saw enormous spikes up and down in long-term interest rates, and that fed through to the corporate bond markets as well. That had a knock-on implication to pension schemes that were looking to mitigate interest rate risk within their investment strategies. So that LDI or matching fund that I was talking about for with profits. And the first thing I will say is that for the with profits section, we did not see some of the issues that many other pension schemes in the market faced. So the scheme navigated the gilts crisis very, very well, but clearly it was still a pretty challenging time. Now, a lot of this is well documented in the press, but as a brief reminder as to what happened towards the back end of last year, and what LDI is. So I talked about 45% of the assets looking to mitigate that interest rate and inflation risk. Those 45% of assets are mitigating risk across the whole of the liabilities. So effectively, there is leverage in the LDI strategies. Not much, but there is some. But where interest rates are rising, and how these LDI strategies work, you need to post some cash and collateral to investment banks that sit on the other side of these strategies. Many pension schemes through this period didn't have the cash and the liquidity available to meet those collateral calls, as they're known, and that caused a spiral in the market. These hedges and LDI strategies needed to be unwound, and some pension schemes saw significant deficits emerge through that period. As I said, for the with-profit section, we were able to meet all of those cash collaterals. We were able to maintain that of hedging to a high degree of accuracy, albeit we did make some small reductions, and we navigated the crisis very, very well, considering the challenges we were faced with. That's some of the background. So clearly a very tough market backdrop. In summary, we've got the here, inflation rising, and the subsequent central bank response from an interest rate rising perspective was the key driver of that equity market volatility we saw on that first slide. We also saw bond markets falling, and we had in the UK that gilts crisis, which kind of topped it all off towards the back end of the year. So having an environment where there wasn't many places to hide and earn return meant it was a difficult period to earn a positive number to close the deficit. So if I put that into context then for the with-profits performance over 2022. So on the left-hand side of this chart here, we've got a series of bars. The pink and the purple represent those market numbers that I showed you on that first slide. So, we said that equity markets were down somewhere between 15 to 20%. Bond markets were down somewhere between 15 to 20% as well. In the context of that number, the with-profits investment fund, so this is 55% allocation, was down 9%. So still, we saw a good level of protection relative to numbers that we could have seen. And that was driven by the decision-making of the trustees in terms of being dynamic in how they manage that portfolio and some of those risk management tools that we have in the portfolio. So it was a good level of protection, but it wasn't able to achieve the 5.2%, which is the lighter blue, which is the number that we needed to achieve to maintain the deficit as it was at the start of last year. So any underperformance relative to that 5.2% will flow through to a funding deterioration. And in an environment where everything was down, delivering that 5% was a challenge. And that is the primary reason on the right-hand side, we saw the decrease from around 100% funded to where it was towards the back end of last year. If we put those percentages then into pound terms from a deficit perspective, so at the start of 2022, we were sitting on a very small surplus of just over £1 million. The impact of those market falls, as I talked about, was the primary and the biggest impact on why we saw ourselves in a deficit position at the end of the year. That had about an 8.3 million or 8.8 million pound impact. The LDI impact is small relative to what it could have been, albeit it had a small negative effect. And you add all of that stuff together, it gets you to a position at the end of the year where there was a deficit of 8.4 million. Come down a little bit since then, and Peter might touch in the next section. So hopefully that just gives you some context to why we've seen that deficit emerge. Very challenging environment. Not a lot of places to earn a positive return over that 12-month period. We did protect in terms of performance more than we might have seen had we had a more simple investment strategy in place, but we weren't able to deliver that 5% return that we need in order to maintain the deficit.
Thank you, Ross.
I'll pass over to Peter.
Thanks, Ross. My name is Peter Black. I'm the scheme actuary to the with profits section. I'm just going to cover some of the actuarial and funding points now. So just by introduction, this is the 2022 valuation that we're talking about here. It's just an interim valuation. The last formal valuation was at 31st December 2020, and therefore the next formal valuation is due at 31st December 23. So, as Anna said, the trustee is duty bound to consider using the contribution rule, and the trustee is considering bringing this forward. What am I going to cover in this presentation? A bit of a simplified example of how the liabilities are split by employer, because I know a number of the employers have raised questions about this in advance. The regulatory background for funding valuations. Where are we now? What's the current position in terms of funding? What has changed compared to previous years, and where we're going into the future? And I say here, there is going to be a new funding regime coming in at some point, although it keeps getting delayed. And what might the options be to the with profits section? The allocation between employers. So this is really, it is very complicated. I'll try to split this, make this as simple as possible. So in this case, we've got two existing employers, employer A and employer B. We've also got one member who's an orphan. So that's sort of technical pensions term. It just means that they work for a firm that's now become insolvent. So there isn't an ongoing employer attached to them. So the total liabilities, we add up on the right of all these members. So some of them are deferred, some of them are pensioners, comes to £1,050,000. Employer A liabilities total 800,000. Employer B's liabilities total 200,000. So the total liabilities for active employers is a million. So 80% to employer A, 20% to employer B, and we just take the deficit from time to time and apply 80% to employer A and 20% to employer B. So effectively, that orphan liability is effectively split 80% to A and 20% to B. So any orphan liabilities are just split in proportion to the liabilities that we can actually identify by employer. And in the example there, if the deficit's 2 million, employer A has 6 million, 4 million. That is a very much simplified example, and if anyone has any more detailed questions, we can answer separately. So just in terms of regulatory background, sort of very basic canter through what a valuation is. So it's really a model of the future income and outgo streams of the pension scheme. So what we're really doing is we're estimating the assets we need now to meet the future payments from the scheme. The important thing on the right there is the valuation is an educated estimate. We don't actually know the cost of the benefits until the last member dies, or in this case, we're aiming to buy out with an insurer. So it's really down to the cost of insuring when we get to the time when we can insure. So what are the key considerations? You need to keep the two sides balanced. So on the right, we have liabilities, and these are the benefit payments. So you need to pay for all the members and the expenses of running on the scheme. And on the left-hand side, we've got the current assets, and then we need to fill that gap. And that can only be filled by future investment returns, which we can anticipate, and future contributions if needed. So what are the main assumptions? So the key one is what are the expected returns? What returns can we sensibly anticipate on the assets? And there are a lot of considerations there, which we'll cover later. The next two are assumptions that are usually pretty key in defined benefit pension schemes, for those of you who are used to working with defined benefit pension schemes. So longevity, how long will pensioners live? But in this case, only around a quarter of the with profit section benefits are payable for life, for the reasons that were covered before, that pensioners now have to take their money elsewhere. They can't secure a benefit within the scheme. Those pensioners are very old, so their effect on the liability is small. In terms of inflation, what would future price inflation be? Well, again, there is no inflation for the non-pensioners. For the pensioners, only around 2/3 of those pensioners, which is around 15% of total liabilities, are linked to inflation. And that inflation linkage is capped. So it's inflation up to 3% or 5%, depending on when you retired and what you wanted to buy at that time. So the main point of that is that the other two main assumptions, which would normally affect a pension scheme, are much less material here than you would typically expect. So what's required under the current scheme funding valuation regime? So we need to do a formal valuation every 3 years with interim annual updates. In this case, we actually do perform effectively a full valuation. We do a proper assessment of the assets and liabilities every year. The assets are taken at market value. The benefits are valued with prudent assumptions reviewed at each formal valuation. That level of prudence is linked to the strength of the employer covenant. The financial assumptions need to be market consistent, related to the investment strategy. So we take advice from Ross on what we should do there and consider it together. Demographic assumptions should reflect the main characteristics of your particular membership, because obviously that can differ very much depending on social class, etc. Crucial point there is, as I said before, the strength of the base is linked to the covenant of the employers. So I think this has been covered several times, but if you have a very strong covenant, you can take more investment risk because the employers can meet things if it doesn't go so well. And therefore, you can assume more investment returns, and therefore you can have a weaker funding basis. You need less money now to meet the benefits in the future. If a deficit is revealed, you need to implement a recovery plan to restore to 100% funding within a particular period, and that again may include future contributions from employers. It's a mixture of investment returns and contributions, as discussed before. So where are we now? Just a brief talk about the assumptions here. So the assumptions are agreed at the time of the formal valuation, having taken actuarial advice and consultants. And the last valuation, as we said, was at the end of December 2020. And what was considered, the very strong covenants, as we discussed, the investment strategy, so the 55% on risk, the 45% off risk, as covered by Ross. The fact that in the longer term, there is a wish to reduce that allocation. So if we do get very strong investment returns, there's a wish to bank those and reduce that on risk amount. And of course, full protection where possible against movement in interest rates and inflation. And Ross covered that this is the first time that has slightly come off, but only went down to 90%. The membership profile is very unusual in this scheme. There are only 2,500 non-pensioners and 900 pensioners, which is a large number, I'd say, relative to the most schemes, but they're relatively small benefits. And the average age of the pensioners at the end of 2022 was 84. So it's a very old pensioner membership. We did some investigation as required into the longevity and expect the pensioners' life expectancy is expected to be slightly shorter for males and broadly the same for females against the average pension scheme tables. So largely in line with the sort of defined benefit universe in the UK. But as I said before, that assumption doesn't make a lot of difference in this section, given the nature of the benefits. So the bit we've got involved there, the figures in this paper is based on the current funding assumptions. There is a new funding regime expected soon. And if this comes in as expected, this is very likely to require a lower risk strategy, and a lower risk investment strategy will lead to a worse funding position. So we're not able to anticipate such high returns. We need more money now, and therefore the deficit will be bigger. What was the assumption on future investment returns? So this is in line with the yield on gilts from time to time, plus some outperformance until 2029. And that's the crucial date, because there we're assuming that at the end of 2029, we will have enough money to go to the insurance market. There is some allowance for on-risk assets, and this is taking Ross's expected returns and taking a little bit of prudence off. It varies slightly from time to time, depending on market conditions, to try and cut out some volatility. But it was gilts plus 2.4% at the end of December 22. There is a whole raft of other assumptions that go into that. But as I covered before, given the nature of the benefits, this is really the only one that materially matters. Just a bit of a word on the new funding regime. At present, and it has been put back several times, it's expected to come into force with valuations with effective dates from April 2024. So that's actually after the next formal valuation. The trustee is currently in discussion with the pensions regulator about how this applies to a cash balance scheme such as the with profit scheme. If anyone's read the draft funding code and the regulations, it just doesn't really cover a scheme in this category. But if you were to take it as read as it is at the moment, given that there's a very short average term to payment of the benefits, you would expect that you would require a much lower level of investment risk to be taken. And as I said before, it will lead to a more prudent funding basis and a worse funding position. The absolute worst case scenario there is that the deficit could increase by another 5.3 million, so very materially worse than the position we're looking at the moment. But as we said, we're in discussion with the regulator about exactly how this will work for this section. So here we are. Here are the funding numbers. So at the end of December 2020, you can see there was a surplus of 0.4 million. 2021 was a good year in terms of funding. Reached the end of 2021, the funding level have increased to 102%. Now, for the reasons that Ross has identified over 2022, unfortunately, this is a very poor year, and a deficit of 8.4 million has emerged. Now, you'll see, as well as the deficit emerging, a crucial point to notice here is that both the liabilities and the assets have reduced by very significantly. Liabilities have gone down because of the huge. So the liabilities, we assume returns based on the gilt yield plus an average. Gilt yields have gone from very low to back up. So we need less money now than we were anticipating at the end of 21, sorry. So the liabilities have fallen significantly. If the assets had performed exactly in line, they would have fallen by a similar amount. Unfortunately, they've fallen by more. But we'll come back to it later. But the fact that the asset base is a lot lower is something that's new and gives us problems in how to go forward, or gives the trustee problems in how to decide what to do now. And then we monitor the funding position regularly. The latest update was at the 31st of May 23. And as you can see, there's a slight improvement, but we're funded at 89% with still a material deficit of £7.7 million. So, as I just said, we do monitor the funding on a regular basis, and this is just a historical graph of how this has happened. So the red line at the top is the accounting position, which the basis is slightly different, so it tracks a little bit higher than the funding position. The bottom line, the sort of dark blue, then green, then light blue, the reason they change is because we change the basis very slightly at each valuation, but broadly they follow a very different pattern. So that's the funding from time to time. Now you can see here that it has dipped below 100% on a couple of occasions, sort of towards the end of 2018, but then it recovered, and a very, very steep dip in COVID to March 2020, but then it recovered again. And that was just through investment returns. But what's happened here is there's been a very steep dip again, but then it's persisted for quite a long time. And we think that given the sustained downturn, the fact that it's maintained that position, crucially, the lower asset base that we have now to be able to invest to get those extra returns, we think it's very unlikely to be possible to get back up to 100% by investment returns alone. What's the position on buyout? So the estimated cost of securing the section with an insurer. As I said before, that is the long-term target for this section, to insure the section by 31st December 2029. But I'm also required to produce an estimate at each formal valuation, and we also do it So here we have, and we don't go to insurer and get a quote. We have an in-house base where we estimate what the cost of insurance might be. So you can see here the deficit on buyout has been quite significant for some time. 2018, it was 12.3 million, 7.1 million at 2019, 8.1 million at 2020. That improved very dramatically over 2021 to when we were actually pretty close, at 96% funded to that ultimate buyout target. But then what's happened since has been a dramatic fall off over the year to 2022, with the latest estimate being a deficit of £9.6 million. I should say in that the unusual nature of this scheme, we're not actually aware of any that have actually gone to insurance transaction before. And we weren't sure whether how we were allowing for that in our basis was how an insurer would actually price it. And we approached two separate insurers during 2022 to firm up on how they would do it, and that we actually slightly weakened the basis there. So the funding level is actually slightly better than it would have been on if we'd used the basis of the previous year. But we think that's the best estimate that we can at the moment of the cost of buying out the section. So what has changed and where might we go now? And this is really sort of firming up on a couple of the points I made earlier. So the market conditions during 2022 have made the section significantly smaller than it was a year earlier. So the liabilities are down by 17%. 5% of that is just maturing. This scheme is very mature and it has to pay out a lot of cash flows every year. And if things stay the same, it will fall off very quickly. The 12% is down to the market conditions. So that's because yields have risen very significantly. That means that the liabilities are, as I said before, we anticipate greater investment returns. We don't need to hold so much money now. So the liabilities have fallen by that 12%. The assets have fallen by 28%. And again, 5% of that is just maturing. We pay out the big cash flows. 11% is the market conditions, so really the same point. Because we're hedged, they will fall and follow the liabilities. And 12% is that underperformance. So it's not just that we've had the 12% underperformance, it's that the assets and liabilities have got a lot smaller. So there's a smaller asset base which we can use to generate those investment returns to close the deficits. And that's why I said before, we think it's going to be very difficult, if not impossible, to meet that deficit from investment returns alone. And as I've covered, if we get to the new regime, and that would obviously really would make it impossible to be able to meet that gap. And then just the last couple of slides, sort of illustration of the points I made earlier about the unusual nature of this scheme and how it's aging so rapidly. As I said before, unlike the majority of schemes, the non-pensioners have to take all their benefits at retirement, which is usually around 60 to 65. So there's no long tail of payments for the younger members. So you see here the dark green bars are the expected payments for the non-pensioner members. And you can see a lot of them are in that sort of 50 to 60 age group now, so that it's not going to be too bad. Light blue ones are the pensioners, and as I said, that's a closed group that's very old on average age 84, and is maturing very rapidly. So the crucial point is the average time until benefits are paid out is only about 5 years. So a typical defined benefits scheme might be 15 or 20 years. So that's very, very different to the average scheme. And it will therefore contract quickly. So if everything being equal, where would we be in 5 years' time? The scheme would be around 25% smaller. You can see the dark green bars have moved further, a lot's fallen off. And the light blue bars have moved even higher into the higher ages there. So, what are the possible levers for restoring the funding position? I've covered here on the investment side. We think the smaller asset base means there's much less scope for returns, and the new funding regime expects that lower risk investment strategy. Despite the strong covenant, there's nothing in there about covenant, which is what we've relied on before. So that means investment returns are likely to be small to meet that gap. In terms of the funding, so the lower risk strategy means lower allowance for returns and therefore higher liabilities. As we said before, you haven't got any chance of, for example, longevity longevity expectations are tailing off a bit because of the nature of your scheme, that's not going to make a big difference. And as we said before, the insurer pricing, I think we were a bit prudent before, but we've now gone to the insurers and specifically asked them how they might price this type of benefit structure, and that's reflected in our ongoing funding basis. So we don't really think there's anywhere to go on the funding side. So really, it comes down, unfortunately, to a recovery plan. Primary source of mitigation likely to be cash contributions. There may be some allowance for outperformance of the investments in that. And the draft regulations require trustees to remove deficits as soon as is affordable, which is something for them to consider. I think that's all I was going to say. I think it's back to you.
Yes, indeed. Thank you, Peter. Sorry, I'm conscious this has been a very long and detailed session, so apologies, but I just have literally, I think, 3 slides just to finish up on. So I'm not going to go over this because I think you've heard it from Peter, but obviously the impact of this deficit is both current, what do we do at the moment, and forward-looking. You'll see there that I've put in funding deficit is estimated to be 8.4, but the new funding code could increase that to 13.7. Both of those figures target buyout in 2029. And so basically the difference between the two is the 13.7 assumes much lower investment returns in accordance with the new funding code. The trustees haven't decided yet whether or not to bring valuation. Whether it's at 2002 or 2003, we need a plan on the back of that about how we're going to restore the funding. So, whether it's one or the other, it doesn't really make... we're just trying to work out the best way of doing that because we want to have a properly thought through plan before we submit that. So I'm not really going to say anything more on that. In terms of trustees, okay. What have I done? Okay, thank you. I hate using somebody else's laptop. The buttons are all in the wrong place, aren't they? So I think the trustees are faced at the moment with no choice. I think Peter put it politely as very little choice, but I think the reality is no choice but to consider using the contribution rule. And it's worth saying that we put the contribution rule in, but we didn't take any decisions about how we would use it at that time, because those decisions need to be taken in the context of whatever situation we're facing. So I can't tell you exactly how we're going to do it because we don't know yet, and we wanted to consult with employers before we took any decision. But clearly it's going to be important for us to work with employers and consult with employers about how we manage this. We're looking to have another employers meeting, and Peter mentioned we're trying to engage with the pensions regulator to see whether there is some flexibility. I mean, it's quite clear from the regs that cash balance just hasn't actually crossed their minds. And when I raised it, they said, it's a really interesting question, which I'm absolutely sure it hadn't crossed their minds. So I have a contact with somebody who's looking at that, and we will be talking to them. There are, of course, pros and cons, because if we could take more investment risk, it would potentially lower the numbers, but it also has the potential for more volatility and therefore resulting in higher numbers. So one of the things we need to consult with employers about is certainty most important, or is the level of the contributions most important? Because it's a bit of a balancing act between the two. Why am I doing this, Chris? I don't know what to do. Oh, there we go. Sorry. So in terms of fairness between employers, we're absolutely committed for that, and that was the reason we introduced the contribution rule. because otherwise a very small group of employers would have carried the weight of liabilities that had been incurred by other employers. As you can see from Chris's slides, we look at covenant in a lot of detail. Well, he does anyway. And just to go to that affordability one, that will be where some of that affordability consideration comes. And we will be looking at that in a lot of detail. What we want to come back with is a kind of framework about how we would assess that. And in terms of the discharge, I think what we're thinking about at the moment is considering a kind of standard approach for employers in particular groups that we think we could manage the reduction in covenant and they could manage the premium that they'd have to pay to discharge. So we're looking at kind of a standard basis. It's perhaps worth just noting that the one discharge we have already signed off was very unusual because that employer had 2 statutory employers and we were basically moving the risk from one statutory employer to another statutory employer, and it was a scheme that's done lots of mergers, so they ended up with 2, so we weren't really discharging the employer. Correct?
That's the FAA I was talking about.
Yeah.
It's charging.
Yeah. Can we just wait and come back to the questions at the end, please? And we are looking at another one that, again, has got very particular. We always have looked at them with very particular circumstances. Fair to say we haven't had that many people asking us until this round of consultation where we're saying we want you to pay us some money. So we are looking at how we do that structure going forward. And then in terms of the next step, please give us information if our database is not up to date. It's a big task for us to try and keep on top of everybody's changes and things in the legal sector. Going to engage with the pensions regulator. We're going to look at the funding assumptions, and we want to prepare some information with a meeting in sort of the autumn. I'm hoping these slides have answered most questions. We would really be really helpful to get feedback from employers about their views on how we should structure the contributions, bearing in mind the requirement that we have to be fair to employers. So indications of the sort of structure you would find easiest to accommodate would be helpful. And it may be that we sort of set up a very small group of employers, who have the opportunity to discuss that and then feed into us with us. And that's kind of how we managed it when the regs first came out. We had 3 or 4 employers who came to see the DWP with us and put their position. So I think we think that might be a useful way. We're not. I think we have no choice but to impose contributions, but we want to do it in the fairest and most effective way possible, and recognising that will vary a lot between employers, which is one of the big challenges, I think. Okay, so I think that's all I was going to say. So do we have any questions from the room?